Fans of the Horus Heresy and Warhammer 40,000, thank you very much for joining me for today's 8th edition Warhammer 40,000 Newsflash, and the date today is the 19th of May 2017. So, welcome back to my ongoing thoughts and musings on the drip feeding of information from Games Workshop to the community regarding the upcoming change in the Warhammer 40,000 rules. To the Thrax drama earlier this week, we are now in a period of whiteboard stability on the graphics front. We've got a nice green border, so I know one of you guys will appreciate that. We've got our highlighter of colourfulness to the underline, and we've got our colourful points. Now, I've not put the eagles on today, and some of these points are a bit gammy because I've got a gammy arm at the moment, which is this one. Which means I can't write very well actually, although you wouldn't believe that looking at my writing, and it just shows how scrawly my writing normally is. So I've kind of held back on the drawing a bit. Before you ask where the eagles have gone, the eagles will make a return. Anyway, let's get into the content of this. So I have coalesced two separate Warhammer Community posts into this one video. The first post is a faction focused post, and that is looking at the Imperial Knights, and the second post is on close combat weapons. I've left links in the description to the Warhammer Community website. I would recommend that you go check those out separately. So let us begin with Imperial Knights. So Imperial Knights, this is an interesting post because although it is a faction focused post, I actually take it as being the first proper look into the world of what super heavies are, so hence I put super heavy peak. So what are super heavies going to be like in the new game, and they actually give us a bit more information than is purely related to the Imperial Knights themselves. So we all know the Imperial Knights, Games Workshop's best ever selling plastic kit, and then for those of us with more money than sense, we've got the lovely Forge World equivalents, and then the Cerastus Knights as well for the really gorgeous looking machines. What do we know? So we've been given the stat line for an Imperial Knight. In terms of its defensive characteristics, this has 24 wounds, a toughness value of 8, a 3+ armor save, and a 5+ invulnerable save. This is interesting information. If we think about a knight in the current rules, it has a front armor of 13 and side and rear armor of 12. So it is a medium armored vehicle. It's not heavily armored. So we get a toughness score of 8 and a 3+ save. So that actually compares directly to what we've been told about the Leman Russ. The 5+ invulnerable save is a change on how the ion shield worked. So if we cast our mind back to, or if we think about how the ion shield works in 7th edition, the ion shield is a player positionable 90-degree protective arc, and any shots that strike the Knight Titan from within this arc are saved against a 4+ invulnerable save. What they've now done is they've reduced the overall effectiveness of the protection capability to a 5+, however they've made that unidirectional, so it now has no directional limitation. I guess we see another example of how the gaming meta is moving with the removal of vehicle facings. Next interesting thing here for me though is 24 wounds. Now in the current system, the Imperial Knight and equivalents, and this is true of I think all the knights with the one exception of the Knight Atropos Cerastus variant, they all have 6 hull points. They're now going to get 24 wounds. That gives us a conversion rate of 1 hull point to 4 wounds. So that's at the upper end of what I'd initially observed, and it seems that the Imperial Knights have been in effect given a generous number of wounds in 8th edition. And perhaps I think this is as a little bit of a balancing effect to account for the fact that all vehicles are now going to be vulnerable to small arms fire, albeit not very vulnerable. So I think they've given it a few extra wounds to offset that, to try to roughly keep it in the same sort of position meta-wise from a defensive aspect as it is at the moment. So that is interesting, and we can all now think about this and the other examples we've been given of vehicles and start to form some thoughts about what vehicles we haven't seen yet are going to be like. And the one that really interests me at the moment is the Land Raider. Is the Land Raider going to be the first vehicle we've seen so far with a 2+ armor save, Or is it going to have a 3+ save and a high toughness value, say toughness 9? Or is it going to have a toughness 8, a 3+ save, but a proportionately high number of wounds? We'll have to wait and see. In terms of the actual fighting capabilities, its basic movement is 12, so it's a fast-moving walker, which is equivalent to what they have at the moment, and its weapon skill and ballistic skill is a 3+ to hit. This is subjected to damage effects, so at half damage, the movement reduces by 1/4 and you lose a point off your to hit rolls. And then once you're down to 1/4 or fewer wounds, then you're on half move and you're hitting only on a 5+. So it's got that kind of gradational degradation if you get damaged effects. The thermal cannon, we get some stats on this, and this is, at the moment, the thermal cannon is a large blast weapon, so 5-inch diameter blast template. In the new rules, it is now going to be a heavy D3 weapon at strength 9, -4 AP and D6 damage. And at half range or less, you're going to throw 2d6 and take the highest result. So that's our new melter rule, and similar to what we saw with the melter guns. So that makes it a hard hitter. Once again, we have a -4 save modifier weapon. We've not seen anything beyond that yet. And we also get to see the first example of a rule which reflects the effect of blast weapons shooting at units. And this rule states that for the thermal cannon, if you fire upon a unit which has 5 or more models in it, it then becomes a heavy D6 as opposed to D3, so you double the number of potential shots you can achieve. So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it doesn't allow you to, obviously you can't have the effect whereby you land a blast that hits 2 units or something like that, or maybe a vehicle and a squad, but it is saying against a unit there is a gaming mechanic in there to allow it to do more damage to disperse targets and point targets. However, nonetheless, D3 shots at strength 9, -4 save and D6 damage plus is obviously going to be a very potent weapon. In one shot, that's got enough hitting power to knock out a Leman Russ. You need above average odds on your damage, but you can do it because a Leman Russ won't get a save against that. So that's a potent gun. And again, we can think about how that might translate onto other heavy weapons of a similar magnitude. The Reaper Chainsword, so the Reaper Chainsword stats are actually taken from the close combat weapon post. The interesting thing here is, well, of course, the Reaper Chainsword is the first 8th edition D weapon equivalent, so that, you know, obviously the most potent damage weapons in the current rules, and this is a considerable change. Now, I really dislike the D weapon damage system in 7th edition. It was mathematically stupid. It was just bonkers. On the 1 you had no effect, on a 2 to a 5 you did D3 wounds, and on a 6 all of a sudden you went up to 6 plus D6 wounds. So the damage curve was just absolutely ridiculous and it made no sense. And so I'm very happy to see the back of that, and I'm pleased to say that from my point of view the new mechanic makes a lot more sense. So the Reaper Chainsword, now we don't know what its strength is or how many hits it does. However, if you do damage, it does a flat damage of 6 with a successful hit. So you don't roll any dice to determine how much damage you do. You just do 6 damage. So let's imagine a scenario where a knight scrapping out with itself. 4 hits or 4 unsaved hits from a Reaper Chainsword will destroy an Imperial Knight. That probably means on average the Imperial Knight is a bit tougher against itself in melee, and particularly now this 5++ save is probably, it may apply in close combat as well as at range. So it sounds that they're overall a bit tougher in general. 2 very interesting weapons there, and our first glimpse at what D weapon damage is going to look like with the Reaper Chainsword. What else do we have? Well, we have feet. Well, we have really big feet, and in particular the feet of the Knight Titans when used for stomp attacks. So the rules on this have changed very considerably. So instead of a stomp rule, we now have what's called the Titanic Feet rule. What does this mean? Well, the answer is we don't know yet, because while they tell us that the rule is changing, they don't tell us how it's changing, apart from the fact that you won't have the auto kill capability of the current stomp rule. So I think that's if you rolled a 6, you would get an auto kill. We also get some information around the Thunderstrike Gauntlet, and with that, as well as being able to whack things at 6 damage points per wounding hit, you can now pick up a monster or vehicle and throw it at an enemy unit to do D3 mortal wounds on a 4+. Another thing about knights is they're going to command melee, and the reason they command melee is they can walk away from any fight they don't like. As we've heard described with some other units in these posts, they can disengage from melee, then still fire their weapons on the turn they do so. So that not only are they going to be very potent in melee, if they choose not to fight, then they just disengage and the attackers are going to get a face full of, well, thermal cannon fire or Gatling cannon rounds or whatever those particular knights might be packing. So that's going to make them deadly opponents to assault. Final thing in the knight post deals with another example of a detachment. This is what's called the super heavy detachment. This is a very straightforward detachment, and all it is between 3 and 5 Lords of War units. So very, very simple. The restriction on this is all units have to be from the same faction, and you get 3 command points as a benefit for this. So basically it's saying a standard super heavy detachment, if you're playing a knight force, you'd have between 3 and 5 knights. It's nice to see that as being a specific option, and I hope that will apply equally to, say, the Imperial Guard with their Bane Blades, and once this filters through to the Horus Heresy, the Space Marine Legions with all their sophisticated super heavy vehicles as well. Yeah, very interesting that, and although this Imperial Knight post is a faction focused post, it tells us quite a bit about super heavies and what they're going to look like in the game overall. Right, so let's now move swiftly on to the second post of today's Newsflash, which is taking a look at the close combat weapons. I do apologise, I just couldn't resist writing that. You just have to, don't you? Right, so what we have in this post is essentially just a selection of melee weapons. And we get examples which are from the Imperial arsenal. I've written here that power weapons are repurposed. Well, power weapons repurposed, I forgot they are. What does this mean? Well, this means that they've redesigned how these weapons work. And let me read you out the stats to make sense of this. Right, so let's start with the power axe. This is strength +1. It has -2 save modifier or -2 AP and 1 damage point. A power maul has strength +2, but only a -1 armor penetration and 1 point of damage. The power sword is strength as user, a -3 armor penetration and 1 point of damage. That represents a considerable shift in the meta around these weapons as to which is, I guess, which is best, because now no one weapon is best overall. So your power axe gives you strength and relatively high armor penetration modifier. The power maul gives you a high bonus on your strength with a small, with a modest armor penetration value. The sword gives you no bonus to your strength, however it has a whopping -3 on your armor save modifier. It looks like they're being given a niche that they're all good at. You might say the power axe is an all-rounder, the power maul is better for dealing with high toughness targets, and the power sword is best for fighting heavily armored but average toughness troops. From the point of view of the meta, that's a fairly big move on what we've been used to. However, from a purpose for the weapons, it's nice to see differentiation and clear applications for each weapon, because in the current rules, things like power mauls are a bit marginal in terms of how useful they are, and most of the time, you'd end up taking a power sword, or certainly I would. I mean, maybe you'd disagree with that. Certain power weapons, I think, were on average more useful than others. Now, I think we're being given quite a different menu of options. Is there any other? Is a menu anything other than a menu of options? That's a ridiculous statement. Don't know where I picked that up. Anyway, the next example given is a chainsword, although this isn't a power weapon. And the chainsword is strength as user, no AP, 1 point of damage. However, you get an extra attack every time you use it. So basically it's to reflect the cutting action of the chainsword blade. So that's nice, because one thing that disappointed me for a long time in 40k was the fact that chainswords were no benefit really, apart from an extra attack. You read the fluff and you watch any movie, chainswords always seem so cool and such a neat weapon. Now they've actually got a specific benefit to having one, so that's really good. If this gets through to the Horus Heresy, Despoiler Marines and Melee Marines are going to be absolutely awesome. I suspect my mate's World Eater force is going to benefit from that very considerably as well, given his plethora of chain axes he has. So back to the power topic of power weapons, and we have our favourite, the Power Fist, also known by us old salts as the Power Glove. Oh, those were the days. Right, so this guy is more familiar. Strength is ×2, AP is -3, and damage is D3. So here we've got a melee weapon that is going to be great for whacking dreadnoughts, heroes, and things like robots and monsters. So I don't know, big demons and various things that might pop out of the ground with Tyranids around. So that's quite neat. Now, interesting thing though is we no longer have the unwieldy rule, and instead you have a base -1 to hit on any power fist attacks that are made. So I've put unwieldy replaced by -1 to hit in the example of a power fist. Is this going to be a general rule that we see introduced for all of the current 7th edition weapons that are unwieldy as they move into 8th edition? This shifts the meta of these weapons very considerably, and instead of, in the current game, you have, when you take a power fist, when you take any unwieldy weapon, you are letting your opponent strike you first by default, and you're hoping that your armor is going to be enough, or you've got enough meat shield troops around you to keep you alive, so you can then strike back with your hard-hitting, armor-penetrating fist. Not so anymore. You're going to strike at the same time as the rest of your squad mates, whatever the circumstances are. However, you're sacrificing some accuracy to use these hard-hitting, high-damage, high-penetration type weapons. So very interesting, and again, a nice differentiation from the other 3 power weapons I referred to earlier. We get another example, so players of the favourite stinking bishop cheese force. Oh, that's cruel, isn't it? I only said that because Matt Ward wrote the rules originally. Now, if you're a Grey Knight player, if you have lots of guys with force weapons, we're now told that force weapons are going to do D3 damage per successful wound. So you can imagine that force swords are going to be absolutely lethal with a -3 save modifier and doing D3 wounds per hit. Nasty. There's nothing there about the actual mechanics of close combat. However, what it is telling is that the flavour of the weaponry is going to shift considerably. What does that mean overall? Well, I suppose if every dedicated melee weapon is now going to have a specific benefit and ability, as opposed to a whole host of weapons at the moment that is simply an additional attack, that is really going to enhance the lethality of dedicated assault units. And again, that's a common theme for 8th edition, that we are seeing in their area of specialisation, units seem to be getting more potent. I think if this does play through as they're describing it, and the suggestion that dedicated melee units are going to be more deadly, that kind of stacks, because I think melee is going to represent in some ways a higher risk proposition to get involved in, because units can now fall back, and there are going to be units that can fall back and then shoot you. You're taking more of a gamble to get into melee. So if you have a dedicated unit, which you pay the points for the assault weapons and melee weapons, etc., what I read from this post is that you're going to have more hitting power when you assault. And that, coupled with the fact that chargers always fight first by default, also stacks to reward you for taking the risk of engaging in melee. What do I think overall here? I mean, in some respects, we're not getting anything fundamentally new here in terms of game mechanics. We're getting examples of how things work. What we've seen here in these 2 posts is very much follows the sort of logic we've been seeing so far with the 8th edition information. We're getting an indication of what vehicles are going to look like again. Another example of what are currently blast weapons and how they're going to work in the new rules. We've got an example of a D-type weapon, so a high fixed damage. I like that. We've now got an idea of what you need if you want to do a super heavy detachment. So those are my thoughts on this latest bit of information about 8th edition. What are your thoughts? Please share them in the comments section, and it'd be good to discuss. So I think that is probably everything for now. I'm probably going to do an extra video in this series where I'm going to talk in more detail about the way vehicle damage is changing and the removal of the facing system, because I've had some interesting discussions with a few of you in the comment section about this, and I think it's worth exploring in a bit more detail to try get our heads around what the game's designers have been doing with removing the facings, because on the face of it, it seems like a simplification and a degradation of the game. However, I think there's some important points to consider why taking the facing system away is actually a really positive thing given the overall game. Yeah, so that's something else to look forward to. Anyway, I better get a move on and do my next Retro Hammer episode, otherwise Hewson 08 is going to start sulking. Thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.